There. That's better. Now where was I? Oh, right! Hello, I'm That Geeky Gamer, and welcome to my show. Well, seeing as I made you all wait so long for new episodes, I decided to give you yet another video today. I've been going back and forth as to what this video should be, but after the last video, I could really use some cheering up. And my nuts could use a little rest. Luckily, I think I have the perfect thing planned. You see, I recently began playing quite a few games I had lying around for one of my old gaming systems, and after reliving some fond and not so fond memories with them, I thought, hey, why don't I share some of these experiences with my viewers? I mean, this will give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about me and my gaming past, and will give me an excuse to relive some of my earliest and fondest gaming memories. So, let's quit dilly-dallying and get on with the show. Today, for this video, I invite you all to take a trip with me down memory lane as we take a look at the Sega Master System and my personal collection of games for it. Yes, the Sega Master System. My first home video game console. Yes, you heard right. Unless my memory is off, this was really the first video game console I ever owned. I, or rather my family, never had an Atari 2600, Commodore 64, or any of that. The only other gaming-related systems I can remember us having before the Master System was an Amstrad CPC and some generic computer I can't remember the name of. However, as both of these were really more computers than they were dedicated gaming systems, I still consider the Master System my first true gaming system, especially since it was a console that really got me into gaming. Now, some of you, in particular any and all American viewers I might have, might be wondering how the hell I ended up with a Master System instead of an NES. After all, the NES ruled supreme in America, basically wiping the Master System off the map. Well, I have a very simple, very reasonable explanation for this. I'm not a fucking American! Get it through your thick skulls! Just because something is popular or unpopular in your part of the world, that doesn't mean that the situation is the same everywhere else, you ignorant pricks!
Caution, this statement is purely for comedic purposes. Most Americans actually have very thin skulls since they don't need much protection for their very small brains. The stupid fuck.
Oh, relax, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness though, the NES wasn't actually as popular in Europe as you might think. Don't get me wrong, it still did pretty damn well, but since the Master System was cheaper and a lot easier to get a hold of, at least from what I remember, the NES never really managed to do as well here. Obviously, some people chose the NES, but they were more the minority. Most people went with the Master System, as did my family. Now, I would love to tell you that we chose this particular system because we thought it was better than the NES, or because we felt it was the best system for us or whatever, but the truth is, we probably got it because it was the cheaper one. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't that my parents were cheap or couldn't afford to buy us an NES, but they did take price into account, and since we didn't really ask them for a specific console, at least not from what I can remember, they probably just felt that we would be happy with it, which we were. Actually, now that I think about it, we actually may have asked for a Master System after all. I'm a bit foggy on the details, but I seem to remember seeing a Master System in a store window or something, and I think I might even have tried it. If that's true, I probably would have let my parents know I wanted one, in which case, they probably bought it as a birthday or Christmas gift or something based on that information. Exactly why we got the Master System isn't really all that important though. The bottom line is, we did and we loved it. I still remember it as being one of the few times me and my brother sat down to play video games together fairly often. Hell, I seem to remember that even my sister would join us from time to time. That didn't really happen that much before or since from what I remember, as my siblings all either grew out of gaming or never really got into it to begin with. I, on the other hand, started my gaming journey with this system and I haven't looked back since. Basically, if it wasn't for the Sega Master System, I might never have gotten into gaming at all. Yeah, without the Master System, I might never have become the individual I am today. I mean, I might actually have had more of a life. Wait. Anyway, let's actually take a look at this underappreciated system, shall we? The first thing to talk about is probably the actual console itself. You see, the Master System actually had a few different versions released in its lifespan. It began with the original Master System, also called the Mark III in Japan, which was a fairly large rectangular-shaped console with a red and black color scheme. In addition to being able to play regular cartridge games, this version also included a card slot to be used with games that came on, well, cards. This slot ended up being fairly underutilized, as there weren't that many games that were released in this format. I myself can't actually remember ever seeing a single one of them. Another noteworthy thing about this console is the fact that it came with 1 or 2 games built into the system. Which game you got depended on which version of the console you bought, but every version had at least 1 game built into it. These games could be accessed when there weren't any cartridges inserted into the console, sometimes also requiring the press of a button or 2 on the controller. This was a feature of the console I always loved. It basically meant that you would always have at least 1 game available, even if you could only afford to buy the console and not any games. A few years after the original Master System, Sega released the Master System 2, and this is the version I owned. This was basically a smaller, sleeker version of the console, and although it was, at least in my opinion, somewhat cooler than the original version, it wasn't without its flaws. You see, in order to make up for the console's smaller size, Sega had to cut some corners, or rather, they had to leave out some features. For instance, they removed the card slot, the expansion port, and the reset button. None of these things were really all that important though. I mean, the expansion port, which as I understand it was intended to be used for various add-ons and peripherals, was never really utilized at all. The add-ons were just never made. The card slot, as mentioned, wasn't really used that much either, and the reset button, although nice to have, wasn't strictly necessary most of the time. However, they also removed the composite video or AV output, leaving us with just the so-called RF output, which isn't really all that great. Don't get me wrong, it still worked and all, but the picture quality was definitely worse, and it was a bit more of a hassle to hook up, seeing as you had to tune in the Master System on your TV. In addition to these 2 models, Sega's Brazilian distributor, named Tectoy, released the 3rd version, called the Master System 3. This version was only released in Brazil, and was almost identical to the Master System 2. The only differences were that it had a different color scheme, it eventually came packaged with the newer 6-button Mega Drive style controllers instead of the standard Master System ones, and it also came with several games built in. Exactly how many games were built in I'm not sure of, as I've seen several answers, but apparently it had something between 74 and 131 games on it, which I think is very impressive. Tectoy also released the Master System Compact, which was an even smaller version of the Master System 2 that used radio frequencies to transmit the video signal. In essence, it was a wireless Master System, and there was also a version called the Master System Girl, weirdly enough, that was the exact same thing, only it was pink. In addition to that, a handheld version was also made and released under several brands, including Blaze, Coleco, and PlayPal. It came with 30 games built in, and I believe it's still in production. If not, it's at least still available to buy from several gaming stores and websites. Now, some of you might be wondering why I haven't shown you any footage of my actual console yet, and well, it's because I currently don't have either of these versions. Yes, I did used to have a Master System 2, and you might even have seen me use it in a previous video, but unfortunately it hasn't worked for quite a while. So, what exactly have I been using to play my Master System games with, I hear you wonder? Well, I've been using a very handy little device called the Sega Mega Drive Master System Converter. Yes, you heard right, the Sega Mega Drive Master System Converter. It's also known as the Power Base Converter or the Mega Adapter, and in essence what this device is, if you haven't figured it out already, is a converter that allows you to play your Master System games on your Mega Drive, and since the Mega Drive is fully compatible with the Master System controllers, you can easily play your games the way they were meant to be played. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any games built in, but apart from that, I think it's a great little device. Now, let's take a quick look at the Master System controllers. There actually were a few variations, but the overall idea was pretty much the same for all of them. The original controllers had 2 buttons and a D-pad, and for some reason some of them also included a thumbstick to screw into the D-pad. They also had the wires coming out from the side of it, which is a bit weird, but at the time that was just Sega's way of doing it. After a little while they changed the controllers so that the wires came out from the top, and the thumbsticks were also removed. Some controllers still had a little nub where the stick used to be, but at least the stick itself was removed. Seriously, why put a stick on a D-pad? I just don't get that. Now, something you may have noticed with this controller is that there are no start, select, or any kind of pause button. Well, that's because the start button is the same as the number 1 button, and the pause button is actually on the console itself. Yes, that's right. In order to pause a game, you had to press a button on the actual console. This could be a bit of a hassle, and it definitely would have been more convenient to pause with the controller, but for the most part it wasn't really a huge problem. It was just a little inconvenient, well, apart from the few times when the pause button was actually used for something other than pausing. I'll come back to the pause button later, but for now, let's continue looking at the controllers. Apart from the few minor problems I mentioned before, I didn't really have any problems with the standard controllers. The buttons were okay and it was reasonably nice and comfortable. However, I did always dislike the D-pad. No, it wasn't horrible or anything, but it just felt a bit loose, especially after a fair amount of use. You see, the D-pad actually consisted of 4 buttons covered with a square piece of plastic, and sometimes the plastic piece just wasn't attached properly. It could be too stiff or more likely too loose. Hell, I can still remember a few times when me and my friends would actually pry off the plastic squares in order to just use the buttons beneath it, which often seemed to work a bit better. I'm not sure I'm making a whole lot of sense here, but basically, the D-pad felt poorly made and it just wasn't all that good. In any case, the Master System, like the NES, also had a lot of other controller types. There was the 6-button version that was made for the Master System 3 in Brazil, and there was also a controller that had built-in rapid fire called the SG Commander. But these were both pretty close to the standard controllers. However, a controller that was quite different was the so-called control stick. No, this didn't have anything to do with the previous thumbstick for the standard controllers, which I still don't get, by the way. It was a completely different thing. It was a much bigger controller that still had 2 buttons, but it also had a big stick that resembled a gear lever. Also, the buttons were on the left and the stick on the right, switching the standard layout of the controls. As far as I know, this wasn't a special controller that was only meant for specific games, it was just a control stick for those who might have preferred that sort of thing. A controller that was meant for a certain type of game though, was the Light Phaser, the Master System's light gun. This wasn't anything special, it was just a light gun, and if you've experienced something like that before, you know exactly what it's all about. Nothing special here, but a really fun accessory nonetheless. There was also a steering wheel controller, obviously intended for racing games, and a trackball controller, which I think was intended for certain sports games and maybe some puzzle games. In addition to that, a company called WKK Industries also developed a wireless controller that used infrared signals. They were only made and distributed in a fairly small quantity though, so it wasn't exactly common to own them. One final accessory that was made was the Sega Scope 3D glasses. This was just a pair of so-called LCD shutter glasses that rapidly alternated between showing images from the TV and showing nothing at all, and somehow this created a stereoscopic 3D effect. I'm not exactly sure how this worked or indeed if it did work at all, but I can tell you that it definitely wasn't all that popular. I mean, in the end there were only 8 games that were compatible with it, and that's not exactly a huge amount, is it? Overall, this was just a fairly useless peripheral. Personally, I never really had anything other than the regular controllers, although I did have a friend who had the Light Phaser, which we used quite a lot. Apart from that though, I never really felt the need for any of the other controllers, mostly because I didn't really have any games for them, but also because they just felt a bit unnecessary since you could use the standard controllers for almost every game anyway. Okay, so we've taken a pretty good look at the console and its accessories, so I guess it's time to take a look at some games. Before we move on to the actual games though, I just have to go off on a bit of a tangent for a moment and talk about the game cases. As you may or may not be aware, the Master System games came packaged in a plastic case, which I for one always really liked. I mean, those cardboard boxes that certain other games came in were all well and good, but I always preferred an actual casing for my games and not just a piece of cardboard that I'd most likely just throw away anyway. However, as nice as it was to have an actual casing, it wasn't always all that interesting to look at. I mean, take a look at the cover for Transbot for instance. It might be a great game, but you wouldn't know that by looking at this fucking cover! I mean, just look at it, it's boring as hell! It's just some sort of weird Lego version of the Statue of Liberty standing in front of a white grid-covered background. What does this tell you about the game? Maybe you could guess from this that there will at least be robots in the game, but even that's questionable. So yeah, this front cover sucks, but hey, maybe the back of the box is a bit oh, come on! The back is even worse! What the fuck is this shit? Just 2 fucking screenshots? That's all you're willing to give us? 2 teeny tiny little screenshots that don't really give us much more insight into the game? Really? Okay, so I guess they do technically show off the game a bit, but come on, you could have done way more! Hell, they can't even manage to give us a decent description! Yeah, it might look like there's a decent amount of text on here, but that's just because it's in several languages. There is actually only 1 fucking line of description on here. Ward off a computerized underworld invasion with your transforming weaponry. Suck my dick. How fucking lazy can you get? Now, some might say that this is far from the worst cover for the Master System, and they're probably right, but I still think it's pretty damn bad, and it's probably the best example I have of the bad Master System covers. Okay, so Teddy Boy and Great Golf aren't exactly masterpieces either, but at least Teddy Boy has some semblance of motion and action in that teeny excuse for artwork, and at least Great Golf is just a golf game. I mean, how can you make a golf game look all that interesting? Okay, that's a little bit better. Thankfully, there were a fair amount of covers that actually had some pretty cool artwork on them as well, so it wasn't all bad. I just find it very strange that so many games could be released with a nearly blank cover. In fact, some of them would probably have been better if they'd just not bothered with the art, because some extremely lazy and half-arsed artwork is almost worse than no artwork at all. Anyway, let's move on to the actual games now, shall we? We have a fair amount to get through, so let's just get right to them, starting with... Slapshot! Yeah, Slapshot. One of, make that the earliest hockey game I can remember playing. Let me tell you, if every sports game out there was as much fun as this, I would probably be a much bigger fan of the genre. Okay, so the game is far from perfect, but for a fairly simple hockey game, Slapshot basically does everything it needs to do right. I'm not quite sure how much more there is to say about this game, considering it's just a basic hockey game and all, but I'll try to go over a few things. For starters, it should be fairly obvious, just because of the type of game this is, that it is intended to be played by 2 players, and indeed it is more fun that way. I still remember how much fun my brothers, my friends and I had when we played this game together. We would have tournaments or just play a few games against each other, and it was always fun. I have to admit though, that one of the things we looked forward to the most was whenever we'd get to fight each other. You see, occasionally, when someone fouls another player, you get to have a fight. In these fights, you basically just have to tap the right button as fast as you can in order to gain the advantage, and the player who has the upper hand when the time runs out wins, and the loser gets sent to the sin bin. Anyway, this game was and still is a surefire way to have a great time with your friends, but it isn't really quite as good when you play it alone. You see, even though the game is still playable in single player, playing against a computer AI just isn't the same thing as playing with a friend. It almost automatically becomes more frustrating than fun, especially when the fucking AI feels like being a fucking dick and refuses to let you score a goal, even if you use a fucking rocket launcher while the fucking AI can just wish for a fucking goal and it fucking happens! Fucking shit! Sorry, just reliving some rather unpleasant memories. But yeah, suffice it to say that Slapshot seems to become much more frustrating and annoying when you play it on your own for some reason. I still consider it a pretty decent game though, just get some friends together if you ever decide to try it out. Next, let's try out Teddy Boy. Man, that kinda sounded a bit wrong, didn't it? Let's try out Teddy Boy here! Yeah, we're gonna make him squeal like a pig! I'm such a sick person. So anyway, Teddy Boy. This is a pretty simple yet very addictive little game. You play as a boy, probably named Teddy, so I guess he's the Teddy Boy. The object of the game is to shoot all the enemies and collect all the balls they turn into. When you've eliminated all the enemies on a given level, you proceed to the next one. As I said, it is a very simple game, but it's also surprisingly fun. It can be a bit frustrating at times, and the levels can get a bit annoying considering they just loop if you get to the edges, but overall, this is a pretty entertaining game. This was one of those games that I think my parents bought from a bargain bin somewhere and that no one really expected to be anything all that great, but when we sat down to play it, we were pleasantly surprised. It wasn't really among the games I played the most, but whenever I did decide to play it, I still remember a smile creeping over my face. There was just something about this game that made it impossible to dislike, even if it was among the simpler, more understated Master System games. I don't really know what else to tell you about this game, so let's move on to a game that I have a fairly strong connection to. The Winter Olympics game based on the 1994 Olympics in Lillehammer here in Norway. It should be pretty obvious what I mean by me having a strong connection to the game. I'm Norwegian, and this game is based on the last Winter Olympics Norway hosted, and as such, it almost automatically holds a special place in my heart. That doesn't necessarily mean that the game is all that brilliant, but fortunately, it actually is pretty damn decent. I won't be stupid enough to say that this game is flawless, because it really isn't, but considering that there actually are quite a few different events available, you're almost guaranteed to find at least one you'll like. I remember how much fun we used to have when we had our own little Olympics with this game. It was especially fun because the game randomly chose which events would be next, meaning that you never knew what the next event would be. This created the sort of moments where you either went, oh hell yeah, I love this shit, or you went, oh fuck, not this shit. And that actually made playing the game even more fun. You could decide to leave out certain events, but I for one always thought the game was a bit more fun when every event was involved, since you then knew that the event you really hated and or was terrible at would be coming up eventually, and that you would have to excel in the other events in order to win. It just created more tension and excitement. Apart from going through the actual Olympics mode, you could also just go through one specific event, but I always felt doing so was more of a practice mode than anything else. You were meant to go through the actual Olympics. Now, once again, this really was more of a multiplayer game than anything else, but it actually wasn't all that bad as a single-player game either. Yeah, it was worse, but it was definitely playable. The thing that really made it more boring in single player though, was the fact that you weren't really competing against anyone. Okay, so you would be ranked against the other countries in every event, but since you never saw any of them competing, except for in the events where there was more than one competitor at a time, it never really felt like you were playing against anyone other than yourself. I guess it would have been really boring and annoying to have to sit and watch the AI go through each event after you, so I'm not quite sure how else they could have done it, but it's still a bit disappointing. Next up we have World Games, another sports game, at least kind of. You see, this game involves going through 4 very special sporting events based on 4 real-life events from 4 different areas of the world. Yeah, it is a little bit disappointing that you only get 4 events, but when they're all this much fun, they really do make up for it. The first event is the barrel jump, which is all about, well, jumping barrels. You select how many barrels you'd like to try and clear, and the more barrels you jump, the higher your score. But the more barrels you select, the harder they are to clear, so you have to try and balance it out. Like all the events in this game, this is actually really fun, especially if you land a particularly difficult jump, but even if you fail, it can be pretty fun and actually somewhat humorous as well. There's just something a little bit funny about seeing this guy fall flat on his ass over some barrels. That's actually something that makes this game even more fun, the humor. No, it's not exactly a laugh riot, but it definitely produces a few chuckles every now and then. Anyway, the barrel jumping is, as I said, very fun, but I still remember how frustrating it could be as well. The thing is that in order to jump the barrels, you first have to build up speed. How do you do that? Well, you have to rock back and forth between left and right on the D-pad in incremental speeds. This probably doesn't sound too bad, but if you remember, the D-pad isn't exactly brilliant, especially not when you have to use it for this sort of thing. It's almost a guarantee that some of your pressing will go unregistered, causing you to lose speed and therefore fail the jump. In fact, I would always make sure that I use the controller with the least amount of wear for this event, since that would be more likely to work. Basically, if you were stuck with a controller with a worn-out D-pad, you were screwed. Then there's the log rolling event. This is the only event in the game where you compete directly with an opponent, as the object of the event is to stay balanced on a log of wood that's rolling in water, and the first to fall off the log loses. Here, you once again had to rock the D-pad back and forth in order to move and balance your feet, so this event would almost inevitably spark an argument about who would have to use the worn-out controller. I mean, whenever I felt like being a prick, I would give my friends the bad controller while I used the good one, almost guaranteeing me the victory. Yes, this was a pretty big dick move on my part, but come on, I was a kid and I wanted to win, damn it! Besides, we usually just rolled the dice, flipped a coin or rock paper scissors over the controllers, so it wasn't like I always made it unfair. The third event is bull riding, where the object is to hold on to a crazed bull for as long as possible, and I have to be honest, I don't really know how you go about doing that. Don't get me wrong, I usually could manage to stay on the bull for a little while, and sometimes even a fairly long time, but I could never really figure out exactly what you're supposed to do. I just mashed every single button and direction on the controller, and if I was lucky enough, I stayed on the bull. I think what you're supposed to do has something to do with the D-pad once again, but I'm not exactly sure what. At one point, it seemed like you were supposed to hold the opposite direction of the one you were falling when falling off, but eventually, that didn't work either, so yeah, I have no fucking clue. My best advice is to just mash the controller like a madman. Finally, there's the log tossing event, where you have to toss a huge log as far as you can. Yet again, you have to rock the D-pad back and forth in order to build up speed before the toss, and then you have to press the 1 button to toss the log. If you time it right, you'll toss the log and get scored based on the distance you reach. However, if you run too far before tossing, you'll drop the log and be disqualified. The same basic thing happens if you toss too soon. You won't drop the log, but you won't get a score either, as the log won't reach enough distance to be measured. One last possible outcome is that you do time when to toss the log right, but you don't have enough speed built up. When this happens, it will appear as though everything is fine until the log fails to flip over and instead falls back down right on your foot. This is actually pretty funny, and I can remember how I used to fail in this event on purpose because it was funnier to see this guy get a huge wooden log slammed on his foot. Okay, it was somewhat amusing to see his silly little dance whenever he succeeded as well, but let's face it, it's always funnier to see someone fuck up, especially when it's not expected. Okay, so let's move on to the first Simpsons game I can remember playing, Krusty's Funhouse. Now, from what I understand, most people don't really have the fondest memories of this game, at least not all versions of it, but I don't know, I don't remember it being all that bad. Okay, so it's not brilliant, but it did have some good quality. Yeah, alright, I see your point, but I mean...
Hi, kid!
Okay, fine! It's bad! It's terrible! It sucks! But I still kinda like it. Don't kill me! Yeah, I know, this isn't exactly the best game around, maybe not even among the Simpsons games, but I don't know, I do have a strange kind of fondness for it. As I mentioned, the hatred I've seen for this game may be aimed more at one of the other versions, like the NES, SNES or Mega Drive versions, but I can't imagine that they're anything all that different, so I don't think this version is or would be received any better. That being said, I do still like it! Don't get me wrong, I can definitely see that it has several weak points, and it's not exactly a perfect or maybe even a great game, but there's just something about it I find somehow enjoyable. So what exactly is this game all about, I hear you wonder? Well, you control Crusty the Clown, which is probably problem number 1 for some people, as he tries to herd together and kill a bunch of out-of-control mice, which I guess is problem number 2. This is basically just a slightly retooled version of Lemmings that just happens to feature some Simpsons characters. Okay, so it's definitely not exactly the same thing as Lemmings, but come on, how can you not think Lemmings when looking at this? You're herding a bunch of creatures, in this case mice, through a maze in order for them to reach a goal, or in this case be exterminated. All that considered though, I still think this is, if anything, a much better variation of the Lemmings formula. You see, in addition to simply using the scenery to lead the mice to their doom, you can also collect weapons, blocks and the like in order to help you out even more. Also, you're not just walking around in a harmless maze, you have to avoid traps, hazard and enemies as well, and am I really the only one who gets a weird and slightly disturbing thrill out of watching those little pests get mashed into pulp, zapped into oblivion or whatever else the game designers came up with? Okay, so I will admit that part of the reason I like this game is due to blind nostalgia and the memories of sitting down and playing an actual Simpsons game for the first time, but still, in my opinion, this game is not that bad. McDonald's Global Gladiators. That's right, it's a McDonald's game. We don't really see this sort of stuff anymore, do we? Games based on or even sponsored by fast food chains or other commercial products? Well, they used to be all over games back in the day, and I don't really see why they couldn't still be. Okay, so far from all these games were all that good, but at least they added a bit of variety and freshness to the industry, and I would love to see something like this pop up again, however unlikely that may be. Anyway, on to the actual game. As I said, Global Gladiators is a McDonald's-themed game, though it's not exactly throwing burgers in your face. You see, apart from the intro and the fact that Ronald McDonald appears at the end of each level, there really isn't all that much about it that seems to have anything to do with McDonald's at all. Okay, so you do go around collecting these floating M's, but the rest of the game involves going around blasting away various toxin-based enemies with your super soaker-looking gun. I'm not exactly sure what it is you're supposed to be firing from the gun, but it looks like some kind of weird goo. Maybe it's snot, I don't know. I'm not sure, but I think this game was actually tying into some sort of recycling program McDonald's might have been going on at the time. Why do I say this? Well, remember how I mentioned that the enemies are toxin-based? Well, the entire game has this environmental/recycling theme going on. The premise is that you play as one of 2 kids Ronald McDonald kidnaps after they mention that they want to be like some sort of gladiators in some sort of comic, and makes them clean up some sort of toxin-filled universe of its baddies and collecting McDonald's M's. What? That never happened to you? Yeah, weird premise, but you actually might not be convinced that it has all that much to do with the environment yet. Well then, how about the bonus stages, which are all about recycling? Literally! All you have to do is put the right kind of litter in the right kind of bin. Yeah, it's fucking recycling! Now, before you get the wrong idea, there's nothing wrong with any of this in and of itself, but we all know how environmentally aware entertainment products can end up. Luckily, this isn't all that bad. Firstly, because it really doesn't shove the environmental message down your throat, it's more like an overall story basis than anything else. And secondly, the actual game is actually pretty fun. Okay, so it's definitely not without its flaws, but overall, it's very enjoyable. The levels are decent, the characters are okay, and the gameplay, although occasionally frustrating, is very fun, varied, and strangely addictive. Let's move on to Walt Disney's classic, The Jungle Book. No, really, that's the actual name of the game. It's not just The Jungle Book, it's Walt Disney's classic, The Jungle Book. A bit strange and unnecessary in my opinion, but fair enough, it is the Walt Disney version we're talking about. In any case, this is a very basic platformer that I still remember having some fun with, but even when I was a kid, I could see that this wasn't among the best games out there. Oh sure, it was fun and all, but it was also incredibly frustrating and annoying. At times, it could be a bit difficult to know where to go or what to do, and I just always found it a bit underwhelming. I will admit that I still do have a strange kind of fondness for the game, as it is pretty endearing, but overall, it's not all that good. I don't really have much else to say about it, so let's just move on to Hang On. This is just a basic motorcycle racing game, and although I seem to remember enjoying it when I was a kid, I can't really say I know why anymore. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is one of, if not the most boring games I've ever played, and it's definitely the most boring racing game I've ever played. Nothing happens in it. You just ride a motorcycle down a road where you occasionally come across some other bikers that do absolutely nothing to stop you. In addition, there are no other hazards apart from at the side of the road, the sound effects are dull and annoying as hell, and there's virtually no music at all. It's not like it's a particularly difficult game either. I mean, it might take you a little while to find the right way to drive, but once you do, nothing, and I mean absolutely fucking nothing, will ever fucking stop you, except for when you inevitably pass out of sheer boredom. Fuck this game! I could make more interesting games out of my fucking bum hair. How the hell could I have enjoyed this game as a kid? I must have been fucking retarded. Okay, next we have... Great Golf. Yeah. It's golf... and it's not great. Next game, Psycho Fox. Now this is more like it. This is, in my opinion, one of the greatest games for the Master System. I used to play it all the time, and I don't think I ever got sick of it. That being said though, it wasn't exactly flawless. Let me begin by explaining exactly what this game is. Psycho Fox is a platformer where you play primarily as, well, the Psycho Fox. I'm not exactly sure why he's called the Psycho Fox, because he doesn't really seem all that psychotic, but I guess it doesn't really matter. As the Psycho Fox, you have to venture through various worlds while battling all kinds of enemies and bosses with the aid of some kind of bird that you can sometimes find inside these eggs. You also have to build up your speed to traverse the landscape, as you'll be able to jump higher and further the more speed you have built up. There's no backtracking either, which makes it very important to keep your speed up. In fact, you can sometimes be forced to commit suicide if you get stuck on a narrow ledge, since you then can't build up enough speed to make the jump, which can definitely be a bit frustrating. There are usually multiple paths to take to the goal, some easier than others, and you can also find secret passages that will warp you to a later stage of the game. In addition to that, there is one more very clever and enjoyable aspect to this game. You see, when and if you manage to collect a certain power-up that looks like, I don't know, a stick with a wig on it or something, you can use it to change into a different animal, each with their own sets of attributes and abilities. There's the hippopotamus, which is slower but can break through rock walls, there's the monkey that can jump higher, and then there's the tiger, which can run faster. This definitely adds a bit more variety, challenge and strategy to the game, but you might be wondering, how do you actually change characters? None of the buttons or any combination of the buttons on the controller seem to have anything to do with it, and indeed they don't. If you recall, I mentioned that the pause button on the console wasn't always used just for pausing. Well, this is an example of that. If you press the pause button in this game, you're presented with an inventory screen where you can see which, if any, power-ups you have collected and how many you have of each. If you select one of them, you'll use them, and if you use the wig stick, you can then select one of the 4 characters presented at the top of the screen. Yeah, it is a bit of a hassle to have to press a button on the actual console in order to open up a pretty important screen of the game, but it doesn't really ruin the game either, in my opinion. In any case, Psycho Fox is awesome, and that's all I have to say about it. Now we've come to Bonanza Brothers, but since I've already talked about it in my top 10 most underrated video games list earlier, I won't go into much detail with this one. All you need to know is that it's a great game that I used to have a lot of fun with back in the day, and I actually still do. It's a simple and basic little game, yes, but it's also really fun. Let's just move on to Transbot, which I've also discussed earlier. Again, without going into much detail about the game, let me just reiterate that this is a fantastic game. I can still remember how me, my brothers and my friends would compete by seeing who could make it the furthest, and I also remember how awesome it was when we actually beat our previous records. I can also remember one more great thing about this game that I actually don't think I mentioned in the top 10 list. It's music. Yeah, it is somewhat repetitive, and I guess it can become somewhat annoying after a while, but overall, I just love it, and it's one of those soundtracks that has just been stuck in my head forever. In fact, let me end my summation of this game by just playing a bit of the music. And now we have our first run-in with the spiky blue-head mascot himself in Sonic the Hedgehog 2. This is yet another game I mentioned in my top 10 list, but I didn't really give you much detail about the actual game, as I didn't really want to spoil anything for you. While that is still true, I guess I can at least give you some details. You should all know the basic gist of the game, you know, run around the level really fast while collecting rings and defeating bad guys, but there is a bit more to it than that in this game. There's a ton of hidden rooms and passageways, some of which you're required to find if you want to collect all the Chaos Emeralds. All the levels are insanely well designed, and the boss fights are fucking awesome. There are also parts where you have to hang glide, which isn't really spoiling anything considering that they show that on the fucking cover, and although that can be a bit tricky, it's still really fun. However, something I again have to point out is the fucking awesome music. I know, a game is about so much more than just music, but since this game is so brilliant otherwise, the fact that it also has some fucking spectacular music just makes it even better. I'm not kidding, I don't think there's a single track of music in this game that isn't brilliant! I'm not going to play a selection of it for you again since I already did that with Transbot, but you should definitely check it out for yourself. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. Okay, fine, I'll play some of the music, but I'm just doing it to shut you up. It has nothing to do with me just really wanting to hear it some more. No, it's just because of you. That's right. It's that awesome. Let's look at another Sonic game, Sonic Chaos. I very briefly mentioned this in my top 10. I didn't really talk about it, but this is one of the absolute best Sonic games I've ever fucking played. As I said in the top 10, I did enjoy Sonic 2 just a teeny tiny bit more, but this game is definitely among like the top 3 of my favorite Sonic games, and it's fairly high on the list of my overall favorite games as well. Sonic Chaos basically took everything great about the previous Sonic games, weeded out most of the bad things, and added some fucking awesome stuff in order to create a fucking masterpiece. For starters, you can choose to play as either Sonic or his sidekick Tails, which from what I understand marked the first time you could actually play as the two-tailed fox, at least as the first player. This game also marked the first time in the 8-bit games that you could use the spin dash move, and it was the first time in the entire series that you could use Tails' flying ability. All of those things helped make this game really excellent in terms of gameplay, but to me, one very important change this game made was the way it handled the Chaos Emeralds. For those of you who don't know, every Sonic game had these so-called Chaos Emeralds that you had to collect in one way or another, at least if you wanted to get 100% or the best/real ending. I never really had any problem with this, but for most of the Sonic games, it was usually a real pain in the ass to get a hold of these emeralds. You usually had to do a specific action at a specific time with a specific amount of rings or some shit like that in order to go to a special stage that could be anything from challenging to downright impossible, and if you somehow managed to complete these stages, you would get one of the emeralds. I guess there wasn't anything all that horrible about this, but in my opinion, the way it works in Sonic Chaos is much better. You see, in this game, there's a much simpler system that is much easier to understand in place. Here, you just have to collect 100 rings while playing as Sonic. As soon as you get 100 rings, you'll be teleported to a special stage where you simply have to reach the Chaos Emerald before the time runs out. Okay, so this might be a bit easier and therefore make it much easier to get 100% completion, but is that really such a bad thing? I mean, it's not like the game doesn't have any challenge, and it can be fairly difficult to actually reach the emerald in several of the special stages, so although this system does make the game slightly easier, it also removes a ton of unnecessary frustration, and how can that be a bad thing? In any case, Sonic Chaos is friggin' awesome, and I've loved it ever since I first played it. It was one of my favorite games back then, and it's still among my favorite games now. I will admit though, that it is a pretty short game, but considering that most of the Master System games actually didn't have any way of saving the game or even any sort of password system, it's actually a good thing that it's not too long. I can't begin to tell you how many times I wish some of these games had a save or password system, or that they were shorter, since it was so insanely frustrating to have played for up to several hours and then have to start all over from the beginning again just because you had to eat dinner or go to bed or something. Yeah, I know, some people just left the console on and resumed playing when they could, but I usually weren't allowed to do that, and I never really felt comfortable doing it anyway, as I was worried it might overheat or someone else might bump into it and damage the game or something, so I usually had to complete my games in one go, which made games of this length perfect. Anywho, let's move on to our next game, the Cyber Shinobi. That's right, it's not just Shinobi, it's Cyber Shinobi. Why? Well, because it's set in the future, I guess. So in this game, you play as a ninja who has to fight his way through a series of baddies in order to reach the goal. Yeah, it's a beat 'em up, and it's really not half bad. Sadly, it's not really all that brilliant either, it's just kind of meh. I do remember somewhat enjoying it, but it never really stood out as anything all that special. It was just a fairly generic beat 'em up that just happened to involve ninjas, and it's not really like the ninja thing really adds that much. Okay, so you do get to use shurikens and a ninja sword, but apart from that, you just kick and punch your way through the enemies. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's basically the same sort of thing every other beat 'em up had you do. Oh, I forgot, you can get grenades and a Vulcan gun as well, but that's not really all that ninja either, is it? I mean, you'd think there'd be something fairly unique and ninja-related in this futuristic ninja beat-em-up, wouldn't you? Seriously, couldn't you give us at least one cool ninja-related move of some kind? Yeah, that'll do! Okay, I think this video might be starting to overstay its welcome, so let's just get it done with and take a look at the final game in my collection, Land of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. I actually only got this game fairly recently, so I didn't really have much experience with it back in the day. I do remember some of my friends had it, and I did see it in a couple of stores, so I did have some awareness of it, but yeah, it wasn't really until earlier this year that I actually got to play it. Thankfully, it is a pretty decent game, and I think I would have loved to have it in my collection when I was younger. You play as Mickey Mouse, as he tries to bring back a magic crystal from a phantom in a strange dream village where Daisy Duck lives in order to bring happiness back to the villagers. To do this, you must go through a series of wonderful levels with lots of platforming and some puzzle solving. Your weapons include your arse, you heard me, and whatever you can pick up and throw. Over the course of the game, you can also find and collect these stars that will increase the amount of health you have, and there are also various special items that can be used for anything from climbing walls to shrinking in size. The biggest problem I had with this game so far is that I haven't really been able to get that far yet. This is both because I just haven't played it for all that long, but also because I reached this one level where I have to get a key and backtrack to a previous area by stepping on these buttons that moves the screen. However, if the screen catches up to me, I die, and there's this one part where I haven't been able to figure out how I'm going to make it through alive. I've probably just been doing something really stupid, or I just haven't seen the probably obvious solution yet, but still, it's fucking frustrating. In any case, Land of Illusion is overall a very good game, and with that said, I think it's about time to wrap up this video. But wait a minute, isn't there one game I'm forgetting? What about Alex Kidd in Miracle World? I did a whole review of that one, so why haven't I mentioned it here? Well, first of all, because I already did a fucking review of it, but more importantly, because I don't actually own a copy of it anymore. You see, when I did the review, I just used the Virtual Console version, as the only other version I ever had was the one that was built into my Master System 2. When that broke, I no longer had a copy of this game, and I simply haven't been able to get a hold of a new copy yet. Apart from that though, you've just seen every game I currently have in my Master System collection. I know it's far from the biggest collection out there, and I probably left out several great games that some people might have expected me to own, but we'll just have to leave those for another time when I've improved my collection. Until that time comes, I hope this video gave you all a little more insight into my gaming past and to a really great and underrated gaming system. I'll probably come back to this console and the games for it in several future episodes, but I think I've said all I have to say about it at the moment. So, let me just end this video by saying thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you check back for future episodes. Until then, go enjoy some gaming memories of your own. Bye.